Before the storm ever formed, before the sea began to lift and the wind found its voice, there was a remark made behind a polished conference table in Manila. It was brief, casual, almost forgettable, but it carried the weight of authority. This is a story of how that remark echoed back, louder than expected, when a typhoon arrived and the Philippines answered in its own way. The American general arrived with a small entourage, crisp uniforms, and the confidence of someone used to being listened to. His visit was framed as cooperation, preparedness, shared security. Cameras followed him through air-conditioned halls and guarded convoys. He spoke often about efficiency, systems, standards. The Philippines, he said politely, would benefit from learning how disasters were handled properly. In a closed-door briefing with Filipino officials and aid coordinators, the tone shifted. Slides compared response times, equipment inventories, satellite coverage. The general leaned back and smiled thinly. He questioned how a country so frequently struck by typhoons still relied, in his words, on improvisation. There was a quiet chuckle from his staff. No one directly challenged him. At the far end of the room sat people who rarely spoke in such meetings. Local disaster officers, provincial nurses, logistics volunteers. They were used to being overlooked. When the general remarked that Filipino disaster response seemed brave but chaotic, their faces stayed neutral. They had heard worse. They also knew storms better than any presentation ever could. The general's visit ended with handshakes and statements about partnership. His words, however, lingered in local offices, in barangay halls, among responders who had carried bodies through floodwater and slept on concrete floors between shifts. There was no anger, only a familiar resolve. Typhoons did not wait for approval. They prepared whether the world was watching or not. 2 weeks later, weather satellites began tracking a disturbance east of the Philippines. It strengthened rapidly, feeding on warm water, gathering structure. Forecast models shifted from caution to warning. The storm was given a name and a path that pointed directly toward densely populated coastline. For many Filipinos, this was not panic. It was routine, heavy and serious. In provincial disaster centers, maps were unrolled and radios tested. Fishermen pulled boats inland. Teachers prepared classrooms to become shelters. Mothers packed plastic bags with documents and dry clothes. There was no dramatic announcement. Preparation moved quietly like muscle memory. This was not heroism. It was familiarity earned through repetition and loss. When the American general was briefed from his base in the Pacific, the typhoon was already classified as severe. He noted the wind speeds, the projected rainfall. He authorized standby assistance. Still, he expressed concern in official messages about coordination, about whether local systems could manage an event of this scale without external command. The storm made landfall before dawn. Winds tore roofs loose as if testing their strength. Rain fell sideways, relentless. Rivers climbed out their banks, and roads disappeared under brown water. Power failed across entire provinces. In the darkness, Filipino responders moved without waiting for instructions from afar. They knew which houses held elderly residents. They knew which roads would vanish first. In one coastal town, a volunteer team tied ropes between concrete posts, creating lifelines through floodwater. They moved door to door, calling names, carrying children on their shoulders. There were no uniforms matching, no cameras recording, only voices cutting through the wind, and hands reaching out when someone stumbled. At a regional hospital, nurses who had slept on site for 2 nights straight redistributed supplies as generators flickered. They rationed oxygen, improvised waterproof covers for equipment, and rotated staff to avoid collapse. Some had families in evacuation centers they could not reach. They worked anyway, because patients were already there, waiting. By midday, the scale of the damage became clear. Entire neighborhoods submerged. Communication sporadic. The American general watched live feeds and situation reports. What he expected to see was confusion. What appeared instead were patterns. Evacuation centers already active. Local officials coordinating through battery-powered radios. Community leaders distributing food that had been stockpiled quietly weeks earlier. Offers of foreign assistance were sent, including from the general's command. The responses from the ground were measured, specific requests, precise needs, helicopters for isolated islands, medical supplies for particular hospitals, no dramatic pleas, no surrender control. The Filipino coordinators spoke with calm clarity, directing resources where they were actually needed. As the storm moved inland and weakened, rescue shifted to recovery, clearing debris, accounting for the missing, reuniting families. In evacuation centers, people shared phone chargers, food, information. Children slept on gym floors while elders led quiet prayers. There was grief, but also order. The system was not flashy. It was human, layered, and resilient. The American general authorized a small team to deploy and observe operations firsthand. When they arrived, the rain had eased, but the work had not. They saw Burundi officials using handwritten lists to track families. They saw volunteers repairing boats with scrap to resume supply runs. They saw coordination without a central command tent. In briefings, Filipino responders spoke plainly about limitations. They did not pretend perfection. They explained decisions shaped by terrain, culture, and trust. Evacuation worked, they said, because people believed the warnings. Distribution worked because communities knew who was most vulnerable. The general listened more than he spoke. One evening, standing near a flooded road being slowly cleared, the general asked a local coordinator how they maintain morale with so few resources. The answer was simple. They said disasters here were not events. They were seasons. You survived them by knowing each other, not by waiting for orders that arrived too late. The remark from Manila returned to the general's mind. Brave but chaotic. What he was seeing now was bravery structured by familiarity. Chaos anticipated and absorbed. A system that did not rely on perfect conditions or uninterrupted power. It relied on people who stayed, who remembered past storms, who taught the next generation what to do. In his official report, the language changed. He noted efficiency not measured in minutes, but in lives accounted for. He described adaptability as a strength, not a weakness. He recommended that future joint exercises observe local models instead of imposing foreign frameworks. The tone was careful, almost restrained. There was no public apology. None was expected. Among Filipino responders, the general's earlier comment was already fading. The typhoon had taken enough attention. What mattered now was rebuilding, returning children to school, restoring fishing routes. Recognition was secondary. Survival was immediate. Weeks later, when international media summarized the disaster, they focused on wind speeds and damage estimates. Less was said about the quiet systems that prevented worse loss, about neighbors who knocked on doors at midnight, about nurses who worked 3 days without leaving. These details rarely fit headlines. The American general returned to the Philippines months later for another engagement. This time, his schedule included visits to local disaster offices, not just national headquarters. He asked questions without assuming answers. He listened to stories instead of statistics. The shift was subtle, but real. In one small town, he watched a drill conducted by teenagers and elders together. They moved with practiced ease, checking names, assigning tasks. There was no tension, only focus. The general stood quietly at the edge, hands behind his back, observing without interrupting. What the typhoon proved was not that foreign expertise was useless. It showed that it was incomplete. That disaster response could not be exported whole. It had to grow from the ground it served. In the Philippines, that ground was community, memory, and an acceptance of uncertainty. The earlier mockery was never publicly corrected. It did not need to be. The evidence had already passed through flooded streets and crowded shelters. It had spoken through outcomes, not statements. The storm had been unforgiving. The response had been human. For the Filipino responders, life moved forward. Repairs continued. Another weather system formed somewhere over the Pacific. Preparations adjusted quietly. They did not wait to be praised. They prepared to be ready again. Authority had entered with confidence and comparison. It left with understanding, changed not by argument but by experience. No confrontation was televised, no victory declared, just a recalibration of respect, earned without demand. In disaster work, the loudest systems often fail first. The Philippines had learned to build quieter ones, networks that bent without breaking, processes that trusted people instead of protocols alone. The Typhoon had tested them, as many before had. They held. The general's remark remained part of the story, but only as a beginning, a measure of distance traveled. What followed mattered more. Observation replacing assumption, listening replacing instruction. When the next storm comes, as it always does, there will be no mention of that meeting in Manila. There will only be movement in the dark, names called out in rain, and a country responding not to prove anyone wrong, but to keep its people alive.